You know, Alice and I are always looking to be more healthy, and we were just talking about how fasting is one of the best ways to do that, but it's so hard. But the great thing about Prolon is that's not what you're doing. It's not that you're not eating for 5 days. Instead, you're using their science-backed program to convince your body you're fasting.
You guys, this 5-day program really is amazing. It comes beautifully packaged and it does all the thinking for you. Each day is its own box. And by following their program, I know I just feel so much better. And I can't wait to experience Prolon Next Gen and continue to see results. For a limited time, you can be first in line to experience the new Next Gen at special savings. Prolon is offering the Prosecutors listeners 15% off site-wide plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe to their 5-day program. Just visit prolonlife.com/prosecutors. That's PROLONLIFE.com/prosecutors to claim your 15% discount and your bonus gift. prolonlife.com/prosecutors.
Let me ask you a question. You have a best friend? How big would it shock you if somebody told you that your best friend just killed somebody?
911, what's your emergency?
Someone on the other line said they kidnapped my son, and they're demanding $500,000.
On September 12th, 1995, 12-year-old McKay Everett disappeared from his home in Conroe, Texas. It was a crime that shocked the community because the suspect was so unlikely, so unexpected.
Former high-ranking police official. He'd run for sheriff at one point.
Law enforcement personnel were pretty much split down the middle over whether or not he actually did this.
And to this day, McKay's mother, Paulette, still feels that justice was never truly served.
I've asked myself so many times, what in the world happened?
Ransom is available now. Listen at ransompodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
This episode of The Prosecutors is brought to you by Huggies Little Movers. Get your baby's butt into Huggies Little Movers. We got you, baby. I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are The Prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, who is D.B. Cooper? Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my bomb co-host, Alice.
Hey, Brett. You know who's looking bomb tonight? You. You guys who are not watching on YouTube, you're really missing out on the full affect. Let's just say that Brett was late tonight. He said it was because he was putting his kids to bed. I beg to differ. He's currently looking at me with some aviators and a cigarette hanging off his lip because he's in full character, let's be honest. And a bourbon. Obviously a bourbon. It's going to be a wild night, y'all, because we're going to talk about who Brett is.
Let me just say, this bourbon is Woodinville from Washington State. So I am fully in character. If you've never had Woodinville bourbon, if you can get your hands on it, basically have to be on the West Coast to do it. Or, you know, it goes as far as Colorado. Actually got this in Colorado. Woodinville, fantastic. You know, normally I'm critical of bourbons not made in Kentucky. You can't be. The Woodinville rye, just beautiful. Beautiful. So check it out if you get a chance.
Well, I don't want to stand in your way, Brett. Tonight is your night. You have been thinking about who D.B. Cooper is for, I think, longer than probably I've been alive. So here is your night. Here's your night is all I got to say.
My question is, was there a DuckTales, a D.B. Cooper DuckTales? Because I feel like I learned so much about history from DuckTales.
That's actually, now that you say that, like something went off in my head. but I don't think I knew it was D.B. Cooper when I watched it, if that makes sense.
By the way, happy birthday, Alice.
No,
Throw that
thank
out
you.
there.
I just ate some cake before I came up here.
There you go. There you go.
That chocolate's going to hit.
Oh, well, you guys know what happens when the chocolate hits. That's when things get wild. Wild on the podcast.
It's already pretty wild. You are D.B. Cooper tonight, so I'm not going to try to steal your thunder.
You know, speaking of DuckTales, I don't know if I've told this story, but basically the reason my wife and I are together is because I watched DuckTales and they had the Kentucky Derby. And so then from a very small child, I always wanted to go to the Kentucky Derby. And then I met my wife and found out she was from Kentucky. Obviously, she wasn't my wife at the time. And I was like, I have to date this girl so that I can go to the Kentucky Derby with her. And by May of freshman year, I was in Kentucky for the Kentucky Derby, and now we're married. So there you go. It's funny how things work out.
You are just the best. Real quick, because people are being really nice in the chat. Nowhere I'd rather be than spending my birthday with y'all. That's all. And
That's right.
Looking at Brett B in costume for my birthday. I'm just going to
That's
assume you're dressed up for my birthday.
I'm dressed up for your birthday. Okay. Well,
Enough.
look,
Enough talk.
Enough talk. I know everybody is so excited by this. I'm excited by this. I hope you guys have enjoyed talking about D.B. Cooper as much as we have. I just want to remind everybody, if you've loved this, I do want to give some shout outs to just some great other coverage of this case. There's a Netflix documentary. It's fine, but the Max documentary is fantastic. You've got to watch it. There are some great books. Into the Blast is terrific. The Last Master Outlaw, great book, riveting book. Skyjack, probably the best book on D.B. Cooper. I have read them all now. The Astonishing Legends, we talk about that podcast sometimes. I really love that podcast. They did some great episodes on D.B. Cooper. And then the Cooper Vortex, which is a podcast dedicated to D.B. Cooper. I don't know if they put out new episodes anymore, but they've got tons. So if you've loved this as much as we have, don't let this be your final D.B. Cooper moment. There's so much more to learn. But with that, it's time, guys. It's time to find out.
We will find out tonight.
D.B. Cooper.
I feel like Brett is not going to leave tonight until he figures out who D.B. Cooper is. So buckle up, y'all, because it's going to be a long night.
Okay, let's start with an interesting theory that the kids brought up when we went to visit them in Lidditz Elementary, which I thought was great. And that's that D.B. Cooper doesn't exist. Not that he died. He doesn't exist. He is a conspiracy. Now, you may be wondering, how is that possible? Well, there's a couple possibilities there. One is the inside man, right? So it's a situation where there is somebody who's D.B. Cooper, but he's not really the D.B. Cooper we all know and love that jumped out of an airplane. But really, he's someone who was in cahoots with the pilot, the co-pilot, and Tina Mucklow, the one remaining stewardess. And then after they got the money, they basically hid him somewhere in the plane where they knew wouldn't be searched, and then got him out later and split all the money. Because the only evidence we have that he jumped out of that plane is the testimony of those three people and some missing stuff. Would have been very easy just to lower the stairs, throw some parachutes out the back, and assume they'll never be found. So that's one possible theory. Now, I don't think I have to tell you why that one would be difficult to pull off. Obviously, you have a heavy presence, FBI and police. You would think they would search the plane very well. And obviously, we don't see Tina Mucklow and the pilots all of a sudden start living extravagant lifestyles. In fact, Tina Mucklow ends up being a nun. So I don't know about that.
How was the nunnery funded?
Well, there you go. There you go.
See, I like this conspiracy theory because there's kind of two versions of that conspiracy theory. First of all, very creative kids. Like, talk about thinking outside the box. There's like the one conspiracy that they were in cahoots with each other, so that there were the three witnesses and D.B. Cooper who was in cahoots. And then there's also kind of, we were talking about, was there ever a bomb? Was there ever even a D.B. Cooper period? It could have just been the three of them, and they wouldn't have to hide anyone at all. Because I would think it's harder to pull off this conspiracy if you have to hide a man somewhere in the plane after it lands. But if there was no one to begin with, and he sat in the back row, and none of those passengers remember a single person, and maybe that college student who had a crush on the stewardess, maybe he just thought he knew who they were talking about, but in fact it was someone completely different.
Now, there's a twist on this conspiracy, and that is that the airline was actually in on it. So why would the airline hijack its own plane? Well, as you may recall from the very first time when we started talking about this case, at the time, there was a big debate in Congress about whether or not there should be security at airports. At this point, there was no security. And the airlines were in the midst of a little bit of recession, so they didn't want to have to pay for it. They wanted Congress to pay for it, but Congress didn't want to pay for it, even though they're getting planes hijacked all the time and they're having to pay ransoms. They're having to fly to Havana. So the theory is actually the airline was in on it. Now, what is some evidence of that? Well, there's one big piece of evidence, and that's that the airline paid so quickly. So the one thing about Northwest Orient that everybody agreed on is that it was one of the most cheapskate nickel and dime airlines out there. It was sometimes called Cobra Airlines because it would strike at anything. So the pilots, everybody that worked for it was constantly on strike because the company was so cheap. To give you an example of something they did, they took all the doors off of the bathroom stalls to increase efficiency because they wanted people to spend as little time as possible in the stalls using the bathroom. That is the kind of thing they did at Northwest Orient to cut costs. So the fact that as soon as the hijacker asked for money, they were like, pay him, just struck everybody as, that's actually not what you would expect from these people. You'd expect them to be like, we'll give him $20
We'll give him the stall doors.
Yeah, exactly. They paid immediately. And so that led some people to think, maybe they were in on it. And this was all sort of a very complex scheme to encourage Congress to pass safety measures that, surely enough, after the D.B. Cooper hijacking, number one, new laws were passed punishing skyjacking and making it a much worse crime if you committed it. And they finally started putting in magnetometers and having security checks at airports. So there's certainly sort of the timing of this was fortuitous for the airlines, even if they weren't in on it.
It's a good theory. Got to give it to Lititz Elementary for that one, because that was not on my top 5 suspects list. And you know what? It's really not that far off, because the thing is, at this point, we have no idea what's going on.
Right. And so, look, it's a great theory. There's obviously holes in it. I don't think we have to spend a whole lot of time on what the holes are. They're obviously there. But I like it, and it's one I wanted to highlight because, like I said, I had never thought of it until the kids always do theories for us and propose sort of their different theories, and that was one of them, and I just thought it was great. So I wanted to talk about that one. Now, look, the next theory is a little bit more likely than that.
Well, I mean, really quick, before you get to it, I want to give, Lititz Elementary all the credit for getting a pretty good one. I'm a little surprised with how bright they are that they didn't actually highlight this number one. I'm not criticizing them. They are a couple decades younger than me, especially after this birthday. But this one just seems so obvious that I was a little hoping it would be one of the first things out of their mouths, to be honest.
If the kids are listening, I hope they know we're disappointed in you, that you didn't come up with this theory. So try harder next year, because this theory is so likely that I just can't believe nobody mentioned it. And that's D.B. Cooper was never found because Bigfoot ate him.
See, kids, that's how it's done.
Exactly. Now, look, you may be thinking, what does Bigfoot have to do anything? Well, we talked about how dense the woods were, how difficult the terrain was, how hard it was to find anybody. Well, that's because this is Bigfoot country. This is the kind of place you go and you have like the Patterson Gimlet film and you see big feet, I guess is the plural, running around all over the place. So just imagine you're D.B. Cooper. You jump out of the plane, you open the parachute, you make it to the ground, and you're like, I got it. And then all of a sudden, you hear like a twig snap and maybe a low grunting sound. And you turn around and you see it. Bigfoot. The only thing harder to find than D.B. Cooper. And what does he do? I mean, he eats you, right? I mean, what else would Bigfoot do with D.B. Cooper? I mean, it's the perfect situation for Bigfoot to get a little midnight snack, as it were. So he eats D.B. Cooper. He doesn't need the money. So, he just like throws the money in the river or whatever. And nobody ever finds D.B. Cooper. So Bigfoot, I think, has to be something you consider when you're thinking about what happened to D.B. Cooper.
And if you're not considering it, you're not considering all of the options here. But talking about options, let's move to some real suspects, shall we? By the way, Lidditz Elementary, if you didn't understand Brett's sarcasm, we are so proud of you, so deeply proud of you. You guys are all such special angels. I hope you know that. I couldn't leave that unsaid, and we love you dearly. Okay, so now these were some suspects that we did discuss with the students of Lidditz Elementary. And look, here's the thing. They are all very attractive in certain ways. There's a reason none of them have been pegged as D.B. Cooper. There are problems with each of them as well. But they have been so highlighted over all these years, kind of feels like maybe one of them has to be D.B. Cooper, right? So let's dive into it. The first is Richard McCoy Jr. So on April 7th, 1972, only 5 months after the D.B. Cooper hijacking, a man traveling under an alias boarded a flight from Newark to Los Angeles. So a much further flight. Now, this plane took off without incident, but once in the air, the man handed a flight attendant a note demanding $500,000 and 4 parachutes. And he said if his demands weren't met, he threatened to bomb the plane. When the plane landed, the hijacker exchanged the passengers for cash and parachutes, so he didn't hold any prisoners. And just like D.B. Cooper, he insisted that the plane take off again, and it was to be en route to the next destination. But before that destination was reached, what do you think happened? The rear stairs of the plane were lowered in flight, and this man jumped out of the airplane. So this sounds a lot like D.B. Cooper, and unlike D.B. Cooper, though, this hijacker was identified, and it was Richard McCoy Jr. He was actually arrested and later convicted of air piracy and given a 45-year sentence. Now, you don't have to dig very deep. You can tell that this is a shockingly similar crime that he committed, and it led a lot of people to believe that McCoy may have been responsible for the D.B. Cooper incident as well. But we don't know definitively, and we may never know the truth. On August 10th, 1974, so like just a few months later, about 4 months later, McCoy and some fellow inmates hijacked a garbage truck and escaped the Pennsylvania prison where they were being held. 3 months later, after a long manhunt, McCoy was finally tracked down by the police, but he wasn't taken without incident. There was a shootout, and he was killed in the midst of it. So pretty soon after the hijacking, he was identified, convicted, was in prison, and before long, he hijacked his way out of prison, but died in a shootout. So I don't think we'll ever know the truth. And as we all know, copycat crimes are a real thing, right? You see this all the time on the news. You'll see not just crimes. We have this with a lot of things. Unfortunately, we have this with, stories of self-harm. There have been studies shown that when teenagers, for example, hear of stories of self-harm of people who maybe are in their age group, they're more likely to do the same to themselves. Same with crimes. We know this from Home Alone, the movies, right? Those pesky robbers, they really like to leave their signature. And then whether there were copycat crimes or not was a question as well. So maybe he just thought D.B. Cooper is such a legend, I'm going to be a legend too, or I'll get away with it because they'll think this other guy, D.B. Cooper, did it, and no one will ever find me. Unfortunately for him, he was found.
And McCoy is only the most famous of the copycats. There were several copycats. I think he's the only one who actually jumped out of the plane. And, if it weren't for D.B. Cooper, if this weren't a copycat crime, McCoy is, whether he's D.B. Cooper or not, his story is incredible. Frankly, I'm surprised they haven't made a movie out of him. We're about to talk about more things about him that makes you think he might be D.B. Cooper. The man lived just an incredible life. And, it's interesting. There's something so tragic, almost like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid about McCoy, because once, he was a National Guardsman. He was arrested in his National Guard uniform because he was going on duty that day. And one of the things he asked was to be able to take off his uniform because he didn't want to disgrace the uniform with the, being shown arrested in his uniform. And the thing about him, once he escaped, it's almost like he knew his life was coming to an end. He didn't want to be in prison. He didn't want to die in prison. So the life he lived he just went on this robbery spree. He's robbing all these banks all over the place. He ends up in Virginia Beach. The FBI catches him. He walks into his house, and he's surrounded by FBI agents, and they all have shotguns. And what does he do? Does he go quietly? No, he pulls a gun on him. So then he just gets basically cut in half by a shotgun blast and has the classic dying words, "I am killed," which, you don't normally think of people actually saying something like that. But he did. And like I said, we're about to learn some things about him and his life before this that were just the things he did. His entire life could be a movie. Alice, I love this time of year. It is a time for renewal. For me, that means reconnecting with friends and family I haven't seen for a while. And when I do, I want to make sure I have plenty of wine on hand for us to celebrate with. And that's why I have FirstLeaf. As America's most personalized wine company, FirstLeaf takes the worry and guesswork out of buying quality wines. To get started, just answer some specific questions about your wine likes and dislikes on FirstLeaf's website. It only takes about 5 minutes to create your personalized wine profile. Then your very own wine concierge will use your responses to curate a customized selection of delicious.
And it's not just the fact that it's a copycat crime that could potentially support this theory that McCoy is D.B. Cooper. So here's the evidence supporting the theory that McCoy is D.B. Cooper. So McCoy actually looks like the composite sketch of D.B. Cooper. He has kind of the similar features. He doesn't look as much like D.B. Cooper as Brett does right now, but, you can't really pick too much because we just have knowledge from these sketches. The 1970...
I am D.B. Cooper. So
you are D.B. Cooper. We're trying to explore all the evidence before we come down to the obvious conclusion that it was Brett being eaten by Bigfoot. So another piece of evidence is that the 1972 hijacking was extremely similar to D.B. Cooper's incident. We know that. But here's the thing. Not anyone can just kind of copy this type of crime, right? You can't just be like, that looks interesting. Let me get some parachutes. Let me jump out of a plane. Let me lower the stairs. It still takes knowledge. We talked a lot about how D.B. Cooper seemed to have knowledge about both parachuting, maybe not because of the whole, wrong parachute backup that he got, but lowering the stairs, knowing how fast the plane could go and still stay in flight. So could McCoy have the same knowledge to be able to pull off a copycat crime? So McCoy was a Vietnam vet with extensive knowledge of flying and skydiving. Check. And we think that D.B. Cooper also needed to probably possess that same set of skills.
And let me just say this about his time in Vietnam. It wasn't just that he was in Vietnam. He was like, once again, out of a movie Vietnam. He was a helicopter pilot. He was the guy. Like, if your helicopter went down 100 miles behind enemy lines and you were surrounded by Viet Cong and explosions were going off all around you, he was the guy who would fly in, take out everybody around you, land right next to you, throw you in the helicopter and take off. I mean, really, there are certain people who it's as if they were born for war, and that was him. And he wanted to keep going back. He kept winning awards. Then the war was over. He wants to be a pilot. And they find out he has like a brain aneurysm, basically. And because of that, at any moment, it could burst and he could die or he could pass out. And so they wouldn't let him be a pilot. So his whole life gets messed up at that point. And he goes to school and he's taking a psychology class. And what do you think he wrote his psychology paper on? The psychology of skyjackers. And that's when he got into this whole skyjacking thing. This was all before D.B. Cooper. So, like I said, fascinating guy.
I feel like we should have a movie about him. Maybe we will at this point. Okay, so it's not just kind of us on the outside who see the similarities in the crime that could lead us to believe McCoy is D.B. Cooper. Those closest to him actually thought he was D.B. Cooper. So because McCoy was convicted, he had a probation officer. And your probation officer does things like interview you to know everything about everything about your background so they can properly supervise you. And the probation officer who interviewed McCoy was convinced he was guilty of both crimes, the 1972 hijacking as well as the D.B. Cooper hijacking. And what about location? Because here we have McCoy boarding in Newark going over to the West Coast. Was he on the West Coast in the area at the time of the D.B. Cooper hijacking? The answer is yes. There are gas station receipts and telephone records that indicate McCoy was in Las Vegas the day after D.B. Cooper was thought to have landed. So potential opportunity for being over there. And then McCoy's own son claims that his mother admitted to him that McCoy was D.B. Cooper and that she had helped him plan both heists. Not quite a dying declaration, but like a third-hand dying declaration.
And, you know, if it weren't for the fact that everybody else claims to be D.B. Cooper, too, this would be pretty powerful. But, I mean, it's not him claiming it. So I guess that says something. Now, like I said, this is third hand, right? But still, it's pretty good.
It's an interesting thing to have, like, not your dad, who's supposed to be D.B. Cooper, saying, like, son, I'm D.B. Cooper. The mom saying that she helped plan a heist, admitting to the son, to me seems a little bit more credible than if, like, the actual person was lying about it. But, you know, maybe she was trying to find some meaning after a shootout with the police.
And let me say, the FBI really liked McCoy for the D.B. Cooper crime. The FBI was high on McCoy as far as a suspect.
But there are problems with McCoy being D.B. Cooper. For one, the flight attendant who was with D.B. Cooper the whole time, remember? The one who sat next to him, talked to him, looked him in the face. She did not identify McCoy as D.B. Cooper. That's a pretty big thing. And it's not like these hijackings took place, you know, decades apart. They happened pretty close in time. We also know that even though McCoy may have been in Las Vegas, you know, the day after D.B. Cooper jumped, he was with his family the 2 days after the D.B. Cooper incident, which kind of points to the fact that he likely couldn't have done it. And he didn't fit the profile the FBI had created for Cooper. McCoy was notoriously impatient and abrasive, unlike D.B. Cooper. Remember how D.B. Cooper was like a perfect gentleman? And he said things like please, and he was just the consummate gentleman, thinking about meals for the passengers as they circled the skies, waiting for the FBI to find parachutes, things like that. Just didn't seem to fit McCoy's personality, although we can all play, you know, different personality for a few hours. So I don't completely write that off. The other thing is McCoy didn't smoke or drink. Another thing, if you're about to do something you don't normally do, like hijack a plane, maybe that's when you choose to drink, to take the edge off a little. And might as well, if you've always wanted to smoke, might as well smoke then. So again, maybe he didn't smoke or drink, but you can smoke and drink even if you've never done it before.
I will say this, and McCoy was Mormon, and that was one of the reasons he didn't smoke or drink. But I will say this about drinking. Everybody can drink for the first time. Smoking for the first time, a little bit harder. Anybody who's ever smoked a cigarette for the first time knows that first cigarette, you know, when you don't know what you're doing, can be kind of rough. And remember, he didn't just smoke a cigarette. He smoked like half a pack of cigarettes during this time. It's sometimes described as chain smoking. I don't feel like it's quite chain smoking. It's not like he smoked a full pack, but he smoked several cigarettes. So I wonder if this was really McCoy's first time smoking a cigarette, if it wouldn't have been obvious to the people on the plane.
And there are other problems too. Remember all of that talk from the people, the flight attendants who described D.B. Cooper as having like piercing brown eyes? McCoy had blue eyes. Now, of course, you can probably change your appearance, but that is a big difference if, in fact, the memory from the flight attendants was correct, that D.B. Cooper had brown eyes. And the other thing was that McCoy, if this was his at least second hijacking, you might think there's some level of comfort with what he's about to do. But McCoy was described as being very nervous during the 1972 hijacking, which you might find surprising if he had just successfully pulled off another hijacking in the exact same manner.
Now, I want to say this. If you've ever heard anybody talk about McCoy, one thing we've pointed out, it will often be said that he was with his family Thanksgiving, and that's why he could not be the hijacker, who obviously hijacked the plane the day before Thanksgiving. That is not true. As we pointed out, he was actually in Vegas. Now, when his probation officer asked him about that call, he said it wasn't him, even though they had him nailed. I mean, and he actually did a pretty good investigative, and he asked him about, you ever been to Vegas? No. Yeah, so you never stayed at the Flamingo Hotel and bought gas at, you know, this gas station? Oh, no, never did that. And they were like able to show that actually, no, you were there and you made a collect call to your house from that gas station that day. And he's like, wasn't me. I mean, he just stuck to it, just that it wasn't him, which is pretty suspicious. It's pretty suspicious. Now, he was home several days after that, but he also was a little too young for D.B. Cooper. The fact that Tina Mucklow and Schaffner both said this is not him. The other thing, and take this for what it's worth. Remember the tie. They got DNA off the tie. Now, as we have said 1,000 times, just because you have DNA doesn't mean it's DNA related to the crime. And the FBI will admit they don't know if the DNA is related. But they were big on McCoy, despite all the things we just pointed out. But then they compared the DNA to the tie and it didn't match. So his DNA does not match the tie, but that's only significant, obviously, if you think the DNA on the tie belongs to D.B. Cooper.
We've gotten through just really one suspect. So
what about Bigfoot?
I put him in a category by himself because he's not a suspect. He's the obvious answer.
Okay, well, that's a good point. Okay, well, we're moving along. Look, this might be a really long episode. It doesn't matter. Does it matter? It doesn't matter to me. Does it matter to you, Alice? I'm here all night.
I'm worried about how soggy your cigarette's going to get.
I know. I'm gonna need to light this one up and get a refill on the.
Do not light up a cigarette with your children in the house.
I thought
please.
about it. Well, they're downstairs. I mean, it's not.
It does not matter. Do not do that. It will smell in there forever.
Well, whatever. Okay, so Sheridan Peterson. Now remember, what did we say as we were going through some of the evidence? We were talking about some of the factors that you might consider. One of the things we said was, this seems like somebody who is very familiar with a Boeing 727, maybe even someone who worked at Boeing. Well, enter Sheridan Peterson. Peterson was a former Boeing employee who worked in the department that wrote the Boeing 727 jet manual. He was also a skilled skydiver, and he even spent time working at the very same skydiving company, and this is obviously a coincidence, but the same company that provided the parachutes to D.B. Cooper the night of the hijacking. So, what is some evidence that supports him? I mean, one, obviously, is that he was very familiar. D.B. Cooper was very familiar with the Boeing 727. Knew exactly the limitations on it, knew what it could do, knew things that even the pilots didn't know about its capabilities, including that it was equipped with the rear stairs, that it could fly with the rear stairs open, the flaps, everything. Well, Peterson obviously also would have been familiar with all of those facts. It's said that he also resembled the sketch. Now, he's not a great match for the sketch, but as we all know, sketches are hit or miss, right? So he resembled the sketch, and unlike McCoy, he was really a little too young, given that everybody said Cooper's in his mid-40s. He was around the same age. And the FBI did consider him a viable suspect, at least at one time. What are some problems with the theory? Well, this one is going to come up again and again and again. People said a lot of things about Cooper, but one thing they were consistent on, absolutely consistent, was the color of his eyes. And Peterson had blue eyes. Not brown eyes, not hazel eyes, blue eyes. This is a problem. And look, I don't know if in 1971 they had color-changing contacts or not. And I don't know whether D.B. Cooper would have thought to use them. He obviously put sunglasses on later, which indicates to me that if he's using color-changing contacts, if they even existed, no reason to put on sunglasses. In fact, you wouldn't want to put on sunglasses because you'd want people to see your eyes, but he does that. So I think his eyes probably were brown. Cooper obviously chain smoked, and Sheridan Peterson is another guy who did not smoke. And I'm sorry, I just think that's a big factor.
Real quick, I've been really curious about the eye thing, just because obviously today you can change your eye color. Although I will say, if you had blue eyes and you put in brown contacts, I think that may look more natural. But have you ever seen someone with like dark brown eyes who wore light colored contacts like blue? Because I'll tell you, I grew up in the immigrant community where, I don't know, all of us Asian ABCs, American born Chinese kids in the 90s, everyone like dyed their hair blonde and put in blue color contacts, and it looks like really creepy because it doesn't look like you have blue eyes. It looks like you have brown eyes and you drew streaks of blue on top of them. So I was curious actually if there were color changing contacts in the 70s. And interestingly enough, so hard contact lenses were developed in the 70s and 80s, and there were colored lens experiments in the 1960s. So they experimented with putting different colors in them, but it was not something that was like widely available. And I don't think the purpose was to change your eye color. It was to have different tints. So just for a bit of history, it's possible. Maybe he worked in a lens factory that, was experimenting with these colors. So I will say it was being experimented in the 60s. I don't think it was available for wide use. And it wasn't available for wide use for like cosmetic purposes because it was still a very new technology at the time. So there we go. Possible, unlikely.
Speaking of colors, I love your nail color there, Alice. I just noticed it.
Thank
looking
you.
Great.
It's my birthday nails.
I love it. I love it. They're fantastic.
So real quick, since you just pointed them out, I can't believe you noticed that. Thanks, Brett. I had hot pink nails for my birthday. And I also have these, they're not on right now because I have headphones on, but I have these really big, if you saw me at CrimeCon like 2 years ago, you would have seen them, really big birthday cake earrings that say happy birthday that my friends bought me for my birthday 2 years ago in Vegas at CrimeCon, and I wore them at CrimeCon.
Nice.
And now I wear them every birthday, and I paint my nails to match them. So anyway, sorry. And if it's your birthday, I will put them on too.
Well, there you go. One last word on Peterson. I really liked Peterson as a possible suspect until this final little tiny problem, which is Peterson didn't live in Washington at the time of the hijacking. He didn't even live on the West Coast. In fact, he did not live in the Western Hemisphere. He lived in Nepal at the time, which is kind of a long way away and not the easiest place to get from one place to another from. And he had a child that was born about 9 months after the hijacking. So if he made the trip to Washington, hijacked the plane, jumped out of the plane, got the money, and got back to Nepal, it was even more of an adventure than D.B. Cooper would have had otherwise.
That's a pretty big one to have to overcome. Although the knowledge of the Boeing and everything is awesome. That's why I say each of these suspects have like great aspects about them. And there is someone out there who's D.B. Cooper who has all of these aspects. And we're going to get it. We're going to get it today. We're going to get it. Don't you guys worry. Stick with us. Okay, so another suspect then is Robert Rackstraw. Robert Rackstraw was a former pilot and paratrooper, sounds very promising so far, who had racked up quite the criminal record during the 70s. Grand theft, $75,000 worth of bad checks, and the possible murder of his stepfather were just among his rap sheet. So, he kind of went big.
Actually, yeah. I mean, he was, if you've read The Last Master Outlaw, it is about Rackstraw. And one of the things they basically say, they think Rackstraw was 3 different guys at the time, was pulling off all these different scams because what are the chances you have all these different master criminals in Washington at the same time? Rackstraw, D.B. Cooper, and apparently this other guy that they think is Rackstraw. So they're just like, it's Rackstraw, all the way down.
And look, this man has a flair for the dramatic. I'll give him that. Because in 1978, after he'd been acquitted of murder, you've beat the odds. Just go live on an island and stop getting in trouble. He can't do that. You see, he rents a plane. Remember, he's a former pilot, so he can do so. And then he called a mayday in an attempt to, you guessed it, fake his own death. But he did not get away with it. He was caught and imprisoned for 2 years. So, again, flair for the dramatic. I think if he got acquitted for murder and just kind of quietly went on his way, no one would know anything. Why did he have to rent a plane, call a mayday, pretend to die?
I feel like if you're gonna crash your plane, don't name it Mayday. It kind of gives it away, I think. Yeah, I mean, maybe that's just me, but whatever.
Again, he had a flair for the dramatic. Now, Rackstraw is a really popular suspect, though, because of a book written by Thomas Colbert and Tom Zalosi in 2016 called The Last Master Criminal. But many believe they really just did this to sell the story to Hollywood because, I mean, like I said, Rackstraw himself probably going to have movies made about him anyway. Now, the FBI doesn't believe that the evidence they have links it to Rackstraw. So they did consider him a suspect. They looked at him, and one of the things that kind of struck him off their list of suspects is that Rackstraw would have been only 28 at the time of the D.B. Cooper hijacking, which is, of course, much younger than Cooper was described as. Rackstraw is not going to be able to tell us if he's really D.B. Cooper because he died in 2019, not 1978 when he tried to pretend. So he did live a good bit longer than his fake death.
And Rackstraw, I mean, he is compelling just because, much like McCoy, he's a special forces guy. He did amazing, crazy things in Vietnam. And he didn't just do things in Vietnam. He also worked for the CIA. And one of the only groups of people, we've mentioned this before, one of the only groups of people who knew that you could lower those stairs while the plane was flying was the CIA, because they used that aspect of the 727 all the time in their operations in Southeast Asia. So he would have been familiar with the 727. Also, there's just, he probably ran cocaine for the cartels at one point. And there's this great story. And if you read the book, I keep calling it The Last Master Outlaw because that's a much better title, but I guess it's called The Last Master Criminal. But if you read the book, it's not just Rackstraw. So he was buddies with this cocaine runner who worked for the cartels. And that cocaine runner would tell people that he was D.B. Cooper. He would say, me, cocaine runner, is D.B. Cooper. And he had some buddies, and he took them to a party in Washington. And this guy, the cocaine guy, he points to a couple across the way at this party. And he tells the dudes who's with him, he's like, look, you don't think I'm D.B. Cooper. I'm going to prove it. Those two people are going to find some of D.B. Cooper's money. The couple he was pointing at were the parents of the kid who found the money. And when they found the money, we talked about the finding of the money earlier. So the kid has told this story, and the story has been told in various. He is clearing a space for the fire, and his father stops him and says, and you can see this if you've seen some of the documentaries about D.B. Cooper. Occasionally you'll see an interview with these people, and they'll tell the story. And he's like, no, don't do it there. Do it over there by those two sticks that are sticking out of the ground. So the kid moves over next to the two sticks, starts doing it, and then like 3 seconds later, all of a sudden he finds all this money of D.B. Cooper's. Right? Well, so that had been predicted by this guy who was a drug runner who knew Rackstraw. Shortly thereafter, this guy starts telling everybody that he's afraid for his life, that he thinks he's going to be killed. He becomes super paranoid, and sure enough, wouldn't you know it, very shortly thereafter, he dies mysteriously in a one-car accident. And a lot of people have wondered, did Rackstraw take him out because this guy knew that Rackstraw was D.B. Cooper, and he's claiming to be D.B. Cooper and doing all this stuff, and Rackstraw knows he's a liability, and so he takes him out. And that's sort of one of the speculations. And it's sort of, you know what, maybe that's possible, because Rackstraw very clearly did kill his stepfather and was acquitted in what many people have described as sort of a bizarre trial that really didn't make any sense because there was all this evidence against him. He claimed it was self-defense, even though they found his stepfather buried in a shallow grave, which is not the typical thing that happens when you have self-defense. But it made a lot of people in the conspiracy world wonder.
But really quick, I mean, we've talked about this before. Digging a hole is really hard, so shallow grave is understandable.
There you go. Now, you know, any kind of grave when it's self-defense is a little strange, you know? Those of you who watched the whole Apple River trial, there was a lot of questions about what the guy did after the self-defense. And I was kind of like, you know, I feel like it's either self-defense or it's not. And what happens afterwards is not that definitive of whether or not you actually acted in self-defense. If you then bury the person, that's a better argument for maybe it wasn't self-defense. So I'm not sure. But either way, he gets acquitted of this murder charge, which some people have said was because of all his connections. Anyway, he's a great suspect. The book is fantastic. You should read the book. The Netflix documentary is all about him. But the problem with him, the flight attendants, it wasn't like, it could be. It was like, no, that is not him. And he is so much younger than the 40-something years old that people said D.B. Cooper was. Now, I've said the thing about you guys who were alive in the 70s, for some reason, y'all all looked older than you were. You know, I've seen your yearbook photos. You look so much older. Like you looked 40 when you were 17. So that's a possibility, but I think Rackstraw is probably not D.B. Cooper, even though it just a guy who deserves, once again, his own movie.
He really does. I mean, if anything, he Rackstraw, great name also, and enough crimes of his own to be made into a Netflix documentary.
Gotcha, baby. Okay, let's talk about Kenny Christensen. So Kenny Christensen is interesting because he was a former Northwest Orient airline employee, and he had lots of jobs in the airline. He worked as a mechanic, a flight attendant, and a purser. Before that, he had experience as a military paratrooper. Tons of it. So he received specialized training in anticipation of the invasion of Japan. And in fact, he was part of an elite group. Very few people made it through the training. And the idea was he and his friends, they were going to be the first people in. If you guys know about Normandy and D-Day, the first people in were the paratroopers and land behind enemy lines. They cut communication lines. They blow bridges. They're doing everything to make the landing easier. And the landing in Japan was going to be infinitely more difficult than anything they'd done before. So this was a very specialized group of people, and he was going to do that. Now, obviously, he did not end up having to go into Japan. He did serve in the occupying forces, and he continued to be a paratrooper and to jump, and would actually take on extra jumps for money. He loved jumping out of planes. Now, despite earning a modest living as an airline employee, Christensen bought a home. Not totally in cash, but he took out a mortgage for half of the house. And so he bought basically half the home in cash the year after the hijacking occurred. In fact, his income wasn't just modest. He had to take side jobs, including literally digging ditches just to make ends meet. And then, all of a sudden, shortly after the hijacking, he had all this money. By the time of his death, he had nearly $200,000 in savings accounts, a valuable stamp and coin collection, and a house and property he owned free and clear. Kenny was making approximately $600 a month at the time of the hijacking. A month after the hijacking, he lent a friend $5,000 in cash so that she could buy a house. He was also left-handed, which is significant, because so was D.B. Cooper. Now, there are some issues. He was shorter and thinner at the time than most eyewitness accounts claim. Nevertheless, stewardess Schaffler claimed that his picture was a closer match than any other suspect she had seen. His brother claimed that on his deathbed, Kenny said to him, quote, "There is something you should know, but I can't tell you." But he didn't go any further, which I just got to say, if any of you are out there and you're planning on saying something on your deathbed to me, don't say that. Just either tell me or just don't mention it. Like, that's the worst possible deathbed confession.
Really is.
I mean, it's terrible,
because it can literally be anything. It could be like, I really hate your guts, to I am D.B. Cooper.
Well, and the one thing about Kenny was he was gay, so it's possible that it was that. And that's the thing, right? Like, it's hard to say. When that's what you say, it could be any number of things. But nevertheless, he didn't tell him, so that's what we have. Now, here's some interesting things. Kenny had plans for Thanksgiving dinner with a buddy of his, that buddy's wife, and a friend in 1971. He didn't show up. Neither did his buddy. In fact, they never explained why. Also, he drank bourbon and he chain smoked. And not only did he smoked Raleigh cigarettes. A friend of Kenny's identified the tie clasp as one she had seen Kenny wear. Now, the tie clasp was part of a set that you could buy from various stores. One of those stores was literally on the way from where Kenny lived to where he worked. So it's not that surprising that he would own the tie clasp, but it is the only person who has ever been connected to anything that D.B. Cooper was wearing. As I said, 2 days before the hijacking and before Thanksgiving, Christensen and a friend, and I'm not going to name the friend, even though he gets named. One of the books about Kenny actually uses a pseudonym for the friend. Friend is still alive. I don't know, Sometimes we just defame people. Sometimes we try and not. So I'm going to try and not here. So I'm not going to mention the friend's name. But either way, he and the friend, they take off. They don't tell the friend's wife where they're going or what's happening. As I said, the three were supposed to go to another friend's home for Thanksgiving. Kenny and his buddy didn't show up. A few days after, suddenly they reappear. And Kenny suggests that he'd flown home to Minnesota for Thanksgiving on sort of a last-minute thing. This has been proven to be false. So after Kenny died, the new owners of the home found $2,000 and a bundle of 20s hidden in a tree behind his house. They turned that money into the Treasury Department, who then gave them $2,000 in 20s that weren't decayed because this money was decayed. The Treasury Department did not record the serial numbers, so it's impossible to know where this money came from. But nevertheless, it's $2,000 in a tree in 20s. I don't know about you, but I don't typically put my money in trees. But hey,
money really does grow on trees.
That was a different generation. So, exactly, Alice. Now, the interesting thing about the $2,000, that is the same amount in each bundle given to D.B. Cooper. In the house, searchers found a hidden compartment in the attic, which someone could access by removing the insulation, finding a wooden cover, and lifting that wooden cover. This essentially created a box. Now, the space was empty, but it was somewhere that if you wanted to hide stuff, you could hide it. And this was right over Kenny's bedroom. Kenny had olive complexion, as you may recall. People described the hijacker as swarthy, and hazel eyes. Not brown eyes, but hazel eyes, which are much closer to brown than really any of the other suspects we've seen so far.
But if you had a place to hide your money, why would you hide it in the trees? Why would you hide money in the trees in general?
The tree thing, I don't get the tree thing at all.
Maybe he just forgot it because it was decaying. I do have a question about the bundles, though. I know the bundles had the same amount of bills as was given to D.B. Cooper. Is that just because that's the way they bundle it? You know how when you go and get coins and there's like the pre-made coin wrapper and it's like the same number of pennies and dimes and nickels and quarters that fit in each of them? Is it just that banks always do things the same way, that this is how you bundle? It's always, 50 bills in a bundle or something. I don't know that to be the case, but.
Well, if you think about it, if you get a bundle of 20s, it would be 100, right? I mean, 100 seems like a solid number to give you in a bundle. That's going to be $2,000. So it makes sense to me. You're probably right that if you get a bundle of 20s, it wouldn't shock me if a bundle of 20s is always $2,000. Now, why you would then stick that bundle of 20s in a tree? Like I said, this was a different generation. I mean, all of you, I don't know if you guys had grandparents or great-grandparents who lived through the Depression. My grandfather, God rest his soul, he hid money everywhere. I mean, it was like money in jars and random places. The tornado shelter, which we have in the South, there were just like jars of money in the tornado shelter. There were jars of money just in various places. So, I don't know. I mean, it seems strange to me. I wouldn't do that. I put my money in banks, but I've never had to experience a bank run. So maybe a tree is better. I
will say this, though. He very well could have been running drugs for the cartel, just like our previous suspect, because he had a lot of unexplained cash. He could fly. He disappeared right around Thanksgiving. Maybe there was a need for cocaine up somewhere, and his friend was helping him be, a mule. Anyways, I'm just saying there are probably there were reasons that he had unexplained cash, and he certainly seemed to have a lot of unexplained things, and his house itself with all the money and trees and, secret compartments lends itself to probably being somewhat of a guy who had a secret part of his life.
And I'll say this about Kenny. In our outline, which you guys can't see, we have the photographs of these people next to the sketch. Kenny Christensen is a dead ringer for D.B. Cooper. The only problem he has is he didn't have a whole lot of hair. And D.B. Cooper did have hair. Not a lot of hair, but he did have hair. Now, one thing, Kenny was known to wear a toupee. but he never wore it after 1971. So some people have thought that he was actually wearing a toupee. I don't know. I'm going to go on a limb and say toupees in 1971 weren't the most convincing things in the world, and nobody said that D.B. Cooper was wearing a toupee. Interestingly, if you dig into the FBI's files, you will find some of the initial files of the FBI speculated that the robber was actually bald. So there was at least some indication on the FBI's part. We don't know why exactly they said that. But there's at least some indication that they thought that D.B. Cooper did not have hair. So that's sort of an interesting side note to this whole thing.
All right, we've talked about how people have confessed to being D.B. Cooper. So let's talk about one of these people, Dwayne L. Weber. So a man named Dwayne Weber confessed to his wife that he was in fact Dan Cooper just 3 days before dying in 1995. His wife had never heard of D.B. Cooper, and so when he said this, it didn't really ring any bells to her. It didn't flag anything, but of course you're going to remember what your dying husband said to you. So she goes to the library after he died to check out a book on Dan Cooper. And there in the margins of the library book were her husband's handwriting, which, talk about like a message from the beyond. So maybe he was planning this all along. This is a love note to his wife. He knew she was going to go to the library to check this out. Now, we know that Dwayne Weber had a criminal past, and he matched the physical description of Cooper. Shortly before the money was found in the 1980s, according to his wife, Weber came back to a hotel room in Washington dirty from digging. And shortly thereafter, he threw a bag into the river north of the bar, where it would be found less than a year later. Now, this is all compelling, but we know that Dwayne had no experience with parachutes, and also his DNA did not match that found on the plane, so the FBI ruled him out as a suspect. Still, I can't lie, Dwayne is awfully compelling as a suspect. His wife claims that he talked in his sleep, so you may think, okay, the dying declaration was not true. But that's a conscious decision to say you are Dan Cooper. But he also spoke in his sleep, which the idea is you don't really know what you're saying in your sleep because you're unconscious. It's your subconscious that's talking. And his wife said that in his sleep, he would talk about jumping out of a plane with money. And as we said, he had a long criminal history, spending time in just about every prison in America before the crime. And interestingly, he did confess to being Dan Cooper, not D.B. Cooper. Remember, Dan Cooper bought the ticket under Dan Cooper. We think it was a pseudonym, but he still said Dan Cooper. He never identified himself as D.B. Cooper. D.B. Cooper is just a misnomer.
It's funny because the way the story of his deathbed confession is told, he sort of calls his wife over as this very solemn, he wants to tell her something. And he tells her, I am Dan Cooper. She's like, what? It's like, I'm Dan Cooper. She's
I'm
like,
dying.
I have no idea what you're talking about. Like, who is Dan Cooper? Why are you even saying this? And finally he's like, expletive. Never mind. So there's something about the way he confesses that's actually pretty powerful. And she's absolutely convinced that he is Dan Cooper. At one point, she finds a key to a safe deposit box in his belongings. And, they figure out where the safe deposit box is, and they go to the safe deposit box, and they think, man, this is going to be it. We're going to open up the safe deposit box. We're going to find all of D.B. Cooper's money. And they open it up. And the only thing in it is a Soldier of Fortune magazine with an article about, jumping out of a plane, And that's all that's in it. And it's just weird stuff like that. I mean, she and her story is intriguing. In sort of the crazy, and there's this whole subworld of D.B. Cooper, right? I mean, all these people are obsessed with D.B. Cooper. And people hate her. They just hate her because they don't think it's this guy. They don't want it to be this guy. And she's all about it being this guy. He was a complete con man. He had all these different names he used. One thing people speculated about is just, this was sort of he wanted people to think he was D.B. Cooper. He's a con man at heart, and this is the last great con. So he reads the book where he's writing the stuff in the margins. It's not because he is D.B. Cooper. It's because he wants to learn enough to be able to pull this off at the last thing. So I don't know.
I mean, I will say, just I have not done a deep dive into Dwayne Weber, but what it sounds like more likely to me than him being D.B. Cooper is that he did have a long history of being a criminal, and he'd like to be remembered as a hero, not as a criminal, and that he was obsessed with D.B. Cooper because D.B. Cooper was a criminal who was a legend, who was revered. And so I don't necessarily think he wrote in that book to fool his wife or anything. I think he was just obsessed with D.B. Cooper, did all his research on D.B. Cooper, wrote in the margins because he's obsessed with D.B. Cooper, so much so that he's even talking about D.B. Cooper in his sleep. Not because he is D.B. Cooper, but because this is his hero, right? He's not just some common criminal. He is this revered legend who is, there are books written about him. There are no books written about Dwayne Weber. And so instead of just being another guy with a long rap sheet when he dies, he just wants to assume kind of his hero in his mind. And that's what it sounds more likely to for me.
This message comes from Greenlight. Ready to start talking to your kids about financial literacy? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app that teaches kids and teens how to earn, save, spend wisely, and invest with your guardrails in place. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Join millions of parents and kids building healthy financial habits together on Greenlight. Get started risk-free at greenlight.com/Wondery.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Bombas makes the most comfortable socks, underwear, and T-shirts.
Warning, Bombas are so absurdly comfortable you may throw out all your other clothes.
Sorry, do we legally have to say that?
No, this is just how I talk, and I really love my Bombas.
They do feel that good. And they do good, too. One item purchased equals one item donated.
To feel good and do good, go to bombas.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY at checkout.
So let's talk about Barb Dayton. Barbara Dayton, that's right, Barbara. The only, that I know of, the only woman who is suspected of being Dan Cooper. Now, Barbara was born, I believe, Robert Dayton, and she was, in fact, the first transgender woman in Washington State. She underwent sex reassignment surgery, I believe, in 1969, so a couple years before this. Despite that, a lot of people felt like she could have pulled this off if she had wanted to, and in fact, she claimed that she was Dan Cooper. At some point, she recanted. She actually confessed to this after she thought the statute of limitations had run, and then somebody told her, oh, no, they went in and indicted that guy, so if you're really in, you could still go to prison. And so at that point, she recants. Now, obviously, that is the kind of recantation that doesn't necessarily mean a lot. There were a lot of really interesting things about her. Number one, so she had sex reassignment surgery in 1969, but after it, she sort of went through a period of depression. She became kind of a recluse. She didn't want to go out into society. She had concerns about whether or not she would be able to pass as a woman. A lot of things that I think a lot of people who have been transgender have experienced personally. Well, she went through all that as well. And by 1971, she didn't really have any income. She was in a lot of debt. She was relying on things like public assistance just to get by. But she had a lot of skills. She was a pilot, an excellent pilot. She had a lot of issues with the airlines because she felt like the airlines were interfering with private pilots and their abilities to fly, basically. She didn't like the way they were doing things. Remember, what does Dan Cooper say? D.B. Cooper, when he's on the plane, says that I don't have a grudge against your airline. I just have a grudge. She also was an expert parachutist, to the extent that she stopped jumping out of planes because it was boring, which I can't imagine ever reaching a level where I think jumping out of a plane is boring. And why I think it's important, her, Kenny Christensen, a couple of the other people. We talked about how this military parachute they used, even someone who had jumped out of a lot of planes with a military parachute would not have been able to steer it very effectively. They weren't easy to steer. So the typical person in a military parachute, unlike the sport parachute, which was left behind, is they're going to float around in the sky and land wherever they land. But if you were really experienced with this, like everything else, you became adept at being able to steer that a little bit. You couldn't as much as others, but to some extent, which is probably important to survive the jump. So people like Kenny, he probably could have done it. So could someone like Barb Dayton. Now, she also was part Native American, which is important because remember, one of the things people said about D.B. Cooper is he was swarthy, was the way they described him, which means he had darker skin. Barb fits that. Now, her eye color and her hair color does not. And what she told people is that she had darkened her hair. I think she said she used shoe polish or something to make her hair appear darker. No one who described D.B. Cooper said that it looked like he had colored his hair, though I don't know in the moment whether or not that is something you would notice. Moreover, she had experience with explosives. She actually was very knowledgeable with explosives. So if you think it was a real bomb in the briefcase, of all the people we've talked about, she is probably the only person who actually could have put that bomb together. There's a lot going for her. There's a book that some of her friends wrote. They're absolutely convinced that she's D.B. Cooper. If you've watched the Max documentary, she is one of the suspects they spent a lot of time on. Fascinating possibility there. Obviously some things going against her, but I think a good suspect, better than, say, McCoy, for instance, for D.B. Cooper.
Yeah, I mean, this is all really good, but I mean, do we know? So I know that there was this period of depression after sex reassignment surgery, but with kind of that reassignment surgery, did she ever present herself as a man after the surgery? I don't know that there are interviews of people who did say that, and whether there were, because maybe she always had short hair. But I think one thing with D.B. Cooper is that people thought he had very little hair. And of course, especially if you're going to pull off something like this, I would definitely be changing my appearance. So maybe it would be cutting off your hair and, what have you. But I think that would just be an interesting thing of why to pull it off as a man rather than as a woman. Maybe it's more intimidating.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think that she ever did after this, but it's the ultimate disguise, right?
It is the ultimate disguise. Absolutely. Yes. But I mean, one thing, for example, and I don't know the extent of the surgery, but we do know that D.B. Cooper is described as relatively slim, and he wore this well-fitted suit, right? He wasn't bulky. He wasn't overweight. That's not how he's drawn, at least. And the thing about these white suit shirts is they're pretty tight fitting, and you could always wear, if you're a woman with a chest, you can always wear a sports bra to make yourself flatter. But that certainly, I think, would be something that would be noticed, especially because he looks so trim and slim.
Remember, it was an older style suit. So maybe the kind of suit that a man from the late 60s would have worn, but that Barb would not have updated after that because of the surgery.
There you go. Very possible. The point I was making was actually about being able to see a chest through a well-fitted suit shirt that was white, because you can see.
Hey, I've seen Shakespeare in Love.
I'm saying it's possible. You can absolutely flatten yourself. But the sketches of D.B. Cooper are that he's very trim. There's not a lot of space to hide. There's no big beer belly or something. So, again, I think it's possible, but D.B. Cooper has never been described as having feminine features, for example. But one thing going for Barb. Barb cared about feeding people. And you know who cares about feeding people? And has enough foresight to see that people need to be cared for? Women.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I thought you were about to roll into like a HelloFresh ad or something. I wasn't sure where you're going with that, but that's a good point.
Barb would have definitely cooked with HelloFresh for everyone on the plane.
Okay. So those are the sort of the main people. I'm going to run through some people real fast. Just some like, because there's basically
we're already at an
200.
hour, and we've only covered a couple people, but there are a lot of possibilities.
These are the main
remember,
ones, though.
Remember, 800 suspects were cleared by the FBI. We're not going to go through all the 800 today.
Okay, so one is a mass murderer, John List. He killed his whole family. He avoided capture for some 20 years. And some people thought, look, the guy has nothing to lose. Maybe he's D.B. Cooper. It was right around the right time. Other than that, there's no evidence it's him. So I think, and he was eventually captured, confessed to murdering his whole family, said, I'm not D.B. Cooper. Personally, I would grab the D.B. Cooper thing and maybe lie about killing my family. If he's lying, he lied about D.B. Cooper and not the rest of it. So probably not him. William Gossett. Now, Gossett had a gambling and a money problem. His son, Greg Gossett, remembers him having an unusually large wad of cash in his possession around the Christmas of the hijacking. Now, on his 21st birthday, Greg was showed something by his father that would change his life forever. So William Gossett pulls out this sketch of D.B. Cooper, holds it to his face, and says, "Who does this look like?" And the picture of Gossett was submitted by the Gossett family sometime thereafter to the FBI. And look, if you look at the photograph, there is a very close resemblance. But other than that, other than him having some money and sort of alluding to his son that he's D.B. Cooper, there's not a lot of proof there. And if there's one thing that D.B. Cooper case has shown to us, it's that people really want to be a famous criminal and are willing to confess to it. And that, I think, is probably what's happening here. Lynn Doyle Cooper. So this is one of the few people who actually has Cooper as a last name. Now, Lynn was apparently called Dan by his friends. I don't know where you get Lynn or Dan from Lynn Doyle, but whatever. And he was actually fingered by his niece, who was only 8 at the time, but recalled that Lynn and his brother disappeared for Thanksgiving around that time, only to reappear after Thanksgiving to say something about hijacking an airplane, and also that Cooper was a little injured, which made her think maybe he was injured in the jump. She's convinced that her uncle is D.B. Cooper, but other than her own statements, there's not a lot of proof there. He is someone that the DNA has been compared to the tie. It doesn't match, but once again, who knows whether or not the tie actually belongs to D.B. Cooper or not. An early suspect was Ted Mayfield. Mayfield was a famous jump instructor in Oregon, and he was interviewed early on by the FBI because they thought he may have trained the hijacker. He trained everybody. If you could jump out of a plane in the Northwest at this time, you're trained by this guy. That actually led some people to believe he didn't train him. He was him. There's no real proof there to it, though. Walter Racca. So he was a military guy. He was an experienced parachutist. He is another person who claimed to be Cooper. He said that he actually hitchhiked out of the area with a truck driver who was dressed like a cowboy. Now, apparently, this truck driver was actually identified, and he confirmed that he did pick up a hitchhiker around the time of the hijacking. Other than this story, though, there's not a lot to tie Walter to the hijacking, and he doesn't look anything like the sketch. So if it's him, they just got the sketch wrong, which is possible, but he's generally not really thought to be a serious suspect. William Smith. Smith worked on a railroad, and it's possible the metal filings, which we haven't talked about a lot on the tie, actually could have come from his railroad work. The reason he comes up is there was an analyst who took a look at this case and identified him as a possible suspect. But other than this analyst's work, there's not a whole lot there. So that's just some of the people that have been identified as possible suspects. If there's any of those people you want to take a deep dive on, trust me, you can, because there is endless information available on D.B. Cooper suspects.
There really are. Like we said, there were, 800 suspects. And here's the thing. The ones we've talked about, they're popular for a reason. There's things about them that are really attractive because there is a profile of D.B. Cooper, and there had to have been some knowledge about certain things for him to have pulled off to the extent that he did, even if he never made it. There was certainly knowledge there. And so, I mean, I don't know. I'd love to think it's one of these people, but we have to explore this theory. This is the least interesting theory of it all. But I also think it's a very possible theory, and I don't want to be that cold water prosecutor, but I have to. And that's, did D.B. Cooper die on the jump? And none of the people that we've talked about is really him. So many believe that Cooper could not have survived the jump from the hijacked flight. According to Britannica, at that altitude, the winds were more than 200 miles per hour, and the parachute he used could not be steered. In addition, he would have landed in a rugged, heavily wooded area. Now, many doubt his parachute would have even deployed in winds that strong, never mind the issue of steering. So if he was able to deploy the chute at all, he would have been at the mercy of the extremely rough and rugged terrain below. Look, this was a daring thing. You know, we hypothesize that he stood at the edge of those stairs looking out into the abyss of this massive storm for 15 minutes, getting his wits about him. Was he standing there because he was just enjoying the wind in his face before he pulled off the most daring hijacking and, robbery of all time? Or was he knowing that he'd gone too far and there was no way he was going to survive this jump? If his chute never opened at all, he could not have survived at all, no matter if he had jumped in a clear space, as we may think he may have jumped at this point. If the chute doesn't deploy, doesn't really matter if there's woods or not. Nothing's going to catch and break your fall. It's just going to break you. And if it did deploy, I mean, that is still a risky endeavor. And the fact that we don't really know who he is and that just a bit of the rotting money was found many years later could just be because he died that night and he never got away with the money. He was never able to use it. There's no big conspiracy. It ended in kind of the most boring of ways.
And I think you have to consider that as a possibility. And there were a lot of people in the FBI who thought that's what happened, is that he didn't make it. Now, look, one thing about it is, if that's true, they never found him. And the common refrain there is, yeah, but it's hard to find anybody in those woods. Those woods are thick. There's Bigfoot all throughout them. It's hard to get through them. We talked about the Army expedition to look for him and how it got completely bogged down and even they couldn't do it. The one thing I'll say is, I think it is very difficult to find a body in those woods. This would be more than a body. If his parachute deployed at all, which maybe it didn't, but if it deployed at all, I mean, you got to imagine there's just like a body to this day just hanging in a tree in the middle of Washington with $200,000 at his feet, other than the money that somehow got into the river, which is a complete mystery. How that happened, I have no idea. Some of these suspects, we talked about the one who his wife said they took a trip up there and he came back dirty, and it's like, well, maybe he buried some money there and they hope somebody would find it. Robert Rackstraw, they hid the money on purpose, somebody would find it. I mean, I don't know, right? But they certainly have not found anyone who matches D.B. Cooper. And I just got to say, truth matters, Alice. But hope matters more. Sometimes you find your hope and your inspiration in great men and women who do amazing things, who go to the moon, or incredibly brave, or invent some incredible thing, or, create a great business, or invent this incredible thing. But every now and then, once every, I'm not even going to say generation. I don't even know if it's once every 100 years, but once every now and then, your inspiration comes not from a law-abiding citizen, but from a criminal, whether it's Robin Hood or whether it's D.B. Cooper. And there is something about D.B. Cooper that inspires us all. His bravery, his daringness, the fact he was so polite, the fact that he went about it in this way. There is something about him that is pure America. It's hard for me to imagine another country birthing a D.B. Cooper, but America did, by God. And
it's like a twist on the immigrant story, Brett.
Yes, exactly.
You too can be D.B. Cooper here.
Exactly. You can do anything in this country. And I choose to live in hope, Alice. And because I live in hope, I choose to believe that D.B. Cooper stood on the end of that staircase, threw his tie behind him into the plane, jumped out, deployed his parachute, made his way to the ground, and got away with his money. And I choose to believe that the person who would do that was the kind of kind-hearted person who didn't just live for themselves, but did things like gave money to a friend so she could buy a house, and lived a life that everyone described as a good, kind, caring person. So to me, D.B. Cooper will always be Ken Christensen. I believe that Ken Christensen is D.B. Cooper. That is my choice. That is where I stand. I can do no other. And I rest there. D.B. Cooper is Ken Christensen. He lived a good life, and he died never revealing the secret of his true identity.
Sweet, sweet Brett. I'm going to treat you like my kids, and I'm just going to let you believe what you want to believe. Yes, of course, because you've kept your aviators on this entire... I don't know how you can read anything through those, through the entire recording. I will let you have that final word. Unfortunately, I actually think he died. I really do believe that.
The thing is, I think if he died, he probably landed in the water. I think that the most likely thing is there are a lot of rivers, there's a lot of bodies of water. You land in the water, you get washed out to sea. Some of the money ends up at Tina Bar, it gets found. That's a minor possibility of something that could have maybe happened. Much more likely he survived, but I guess that is possible.
Let me be very clear. While I think he likely died, and that's why we haven't been able to identify him, and I don't think any of the people we've talked about, nor do I think the 800 suspects that were on the original FBI list are D.B. Cooper, I also don't want him to have died. Because what an incredible story. And if he did die, I'm glad he was never found, because he's allowed us to have this legend that will continue to endure, because I don't think it will ever be solved. Even if it's Christensen or any of these people, I don't think it will ever be solved at this point. And I love it. I love that it is unsolved. Whether it's one of these people, whether it's an unnamed person, whether they are dead, I'm really glad that we don't actually know. Because sometimes, like you said, it's the hope that's amazing. We cover a lot of gruesome crimes, and they make me very sad at night, and I can't sleep, and it makes me toss and turn. This is not a gruesome crime. It is a crime, but it's an amazing crime, and it is one that DuckTales has made shows about, that there are movies and documentaries about. It's something that allows Brett to light up a cigarette in his house full of children, you know? And it is something that we can all get a little joy out of, because it is like the ultimate American dream to be able to pull off essentially a Superman stunt. And podcasts and documentaries and movies will be made about him, I think, for eternity.
I agree. So D.B. Cooper, wherever you are, buddy, here's to you. I hope you made it. Cheers. We should go to the D.B. Cooper Festival. We
really should.
Yeah.
All right, tell me what you really think about Christensen, because I think that because they've all had so much attention on them, they probably couldn't be D.B. Cooper.
Well, what's interesting about that, Alice, is Christensen had no attention on him from the FBI because, and this is the perfect example of confirmation bias, the lead FBI agent, for reasons that are unclear, believed and would say that people who worked for the airlines were the salt of the earth and they were beyond reproach. And the FBI never looked at anyone who worked for the airline as a potential suspect in the D.B. Cooper case, because they were of the opinion that no one who worked for the airline would be involved in a hijack.
Even if they were former?
I mean, well, he wasn't former. He worked there for another 20 years after the hijacking.
Okay. Well, but see, that's the interesting thing. Like, what was his gripe? You know, because he was like, I have a...
So he was literally having to dig ditches to make money because the airline was so unreliable. And he had worked for them for a long time. And in fact, had worked for them on this place called Shimia Island, which is at the end of the Alaskan chain, if you know how Alaska. So the reason it's called Northwest Orient is because it was one of the first airlines that actually traveled to Asia. And they would fly and they would stop in Shimia for refueling and repairs, whatever they needed, and they would continue on to Asia. And so Shimia was this like rock. They called it the Rock, basically. And he was there for 2 years. He worked there doing all this repair. And that's actually where he met his buddy, who, and I didn't say this in the episode. I don't know why I didn't say this. His buddy,
good thing we're recording.
I know, worked as an engineer at Boeing. So his buddy was working over at Boeing and doing all this stuff. Kenny was very familiar with all the various airliners, and this guy, and the theory is that they did this together. But anyway, and so, Kenny had sort of a weird life. So he was at Shimei Island for 2 years, which was longer than most people stayed there because it was a terrible place to be, but he was there for that long. He then left the airline to go work in a nice tropical location in Bikini Atoll, which sounds fantastic because they're bikinis and everything's amazing. But the reason it's called a bikini is because we use Bikini Atoll for nuclear testing. We dropped all these bombs on it. and so Kenny, probably when he died of cancer later on in his life, was from the radiation that he received from the nuclear testing in Bikini Atoll. He left Bikini, went back to the airline, worked for the airline, made very little money, and they were constantly going on strike, and he was constantly not getting paid. So he was having to take all these odd jobs, literally digging ditches just to make ends meet. Then all of a sudden, he's loaning his friend $5,000 to buy a house.
The unexplained wealth is very interesting. I will say that. But
and he's one of the few with the unexplained wealth.
He is one of the few with unexplained wealth, but we've prosecuted enough crimes to know there are other ways to get unexplained wealth.
And what's interesting, the McCoy theory is that McCoy was D.B. Cooper, who jumped out of the plane and lost the money. And that's why he did the second hijacking. And that was the theory that his probation officer thought. Was that,
and then asked for like more than twice as much because he wanted to make up for what he lost.
Make up for what he lost. The other theory, and you can go completely down the whole CIA stuff, is that he was a CIA operative, that D.B. Cooper was a CIA operative, and he did this. This sort of goes with the conspiracy theory about the airlines, that this was all sort of a government operation to spur the public to support the spending of money for security on the airlines. And that was part of it. I mean, there's just the great thing, if you've read Skyjack is a great book. Ostensibly, it's all about the skyjacking, but it becomes a book about obsession. And by the end of it, I can't remember if I've said this, so stop me if I have, but by the end of it, like literally the last line is in so many ways hilarious, because by that point, the guy has become so obsessed with the D.B. Cooper case that he is fully in the whole conspiracy thing. It's a really good book. If you haven't read it, I recommend you check it out.
Oh, well, you know what? I don't always end these like series with a smile on my face, and this left a smile on my face, and that is a win.
There you go. This has been a good one. I hope you guys have enjoyed this as much as we have, because we have absolutely enjoyed it. Want to hear your theories? Who is D.B. Cooper? What do you got? What is the evidence? What did we get wrong? You know, what is the sort of knockdown proof you have for who D.B. Cooper is? And look, I'll just warn you, you can lose yourself in this one. I mean, this is one you can fall all the way down the rabbit trail on. So you guys should take off with this case. It's great. I mean, I always wanted to do D.B. Cooper. He was on the original list of things we were going to cover. But it wasn't until the kids wanted to do it where I was like, okay, yeah, I can do D.B. Cooper, I guess. That's fine. Yeah, D.B. Cooper. And now I'm just like obsessed with D.B. Cooper. Like, and my daughter is obsessed with D.B. Cooper.
Yeah, thank you, Lidditz Elementary, for like reigniting this passion. And Brett's daughter will never sleep again because she only wants to know who D.B. Cooper is. And at this rate, she's never going to figure it out. But you know, if anyone could, she probably could.
Whenever we get in the car, she's like, can we listen to D.B. Cooper? So I have to find some D.B. Cooper thing, because we already listened to the whole book. So we got to listen to got to start up the book again or start up Astonishing Legends again so she can hear about D.B. Cooper. She's just obsessed. So it's great. Love it. Want to hear what you guys think. Shoot us an email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod for all your social media. Thank you to everyone who has been with us every step of the way on YouTube. Those of you who are patrons, we love you. You are the best. You keep the show going. Thank you so much. The fact that you support this show and we give you absolutely nothing to be a patron, it's eternally gratifying to me. I appreciate you so much. So thank you to you guys. Alice, we've been going for a while. I feel like maybe we should just close this one off and we'll do questions later.
Let's just let the people go to sleep. We'll do extra questions next time.
There you go. We'll do an extra questions next time.
I feel like we do questions to lighten the mood. I feel like the mood's pretty light. So there you go, guys.
There you go. And you know, this has been great. Next week, we're back to depressing stories again. I'm going to do a missing person story and see how that goes. That'll be what we do next week. And we'll definitely have questions then. For tonight, this one's for DB Cooper. Wherever you are, DB, Dan, whatever you prefer. Personally, I would go by DB if I were you. If you're still out there, shoot us an email. We'll get together for drinks sometime. Next time we're in Washington. All right, Alice. So we'll be back next week. But until then, I'm Brett Cooper.
And I might be DB Cooper.
And this is The Prosecutors. I don't even know. What do we normally say? We are the prosecutors? I'm so thrown off on the DB Cooper thing.
It doesn't matter.
Thought about wearing a suit, but then I thought better of it.
No one wants to wear a suit at 8:30 p.m. So I can imagine a suit. That's good enough.
There you go. Imagine a clip-on tie. Are the people ready?
I don't know if people are ready for this. I mean, I feel like you're already in character because the answer is Brett is DB Cooper.
D. Brett Cooper.
D. Brett Cooper.
D. Brett Cooper. Okay, here we go. Happy birthday.
No, you're not. You can sing this weekend.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Alice. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you, Marilyn Munbrett. Oh my goodness. Thank you. That was very sweet.
Yeah.